Imagine sitting in a restaurant, minding your own business, and suddenly you're aggressively confronted by police just because of how you look. But hold on, what happened next is unbelievable. You might think you've heard this story before, but trust me, a tiny detail turned this whole situation upside down. His morning routine never varied. Coffee at sunrise, a brief walk around the block to keep his joints loose, and a quiet hour with the newspaper. But today, something felt different. Perhaps it was the way the autumn breeze carried hints of change, or maybe it was the letter he'd received yesterday from his old unit buddy, Mike, that had him feeling nostalgic. The letter had reminded him of the Purple Heart medal tucked away in his drawer, awarded for valor under fire during a particularly harrowing mission in '68. On impulse, James retrieved the medal from its resting place. The purple ribbon had faded slightly over the years, but the heart-shaped medal itself still gleamed with the same dignity it had possessed the day it was pinned to his chest. He'd arranged to meet Mike at their usual spot, Lou's Diner, later that afternoon, and something told him to bring the medal along. Lou's had been his sanctuary for the past decade, a place where the coffee was always hot and the conversations warm. The bell above the door chimed its familiar welcome as he pushed through the glass doors at precisely 2:15 p.m., right on schedule. Sarah, the waitress who'd been serving him for the better part of 5 years, looked up from behind the counter with a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Mr. Carter, your usual booth is waiting for you," she called out, already reaching for the coffee pot. The afternoon sun streamed through the large windows, creating pools of light on the checkered linoleum floor. The diner buzzed with the comfortable murmur of regular patrons, Mr. Henderson reading his paper in the corner, the young couple who always shared a milkshake by the jukebox, and Mrs. Patterson picking at her daily slice of apple pie. James settled into the worn leather booth, his bones creaking slightly as he lowered himself onto the familiar seat. The medal sat heavy in his pocket, a tangible reminder of sacrifices made and honors earned. Sarah appeared moments later, setting down a steaming cup of black coffee and a menu he didn't need. He'd ordered the same thing every Tuesday for years. "The usual today, Mr. Carter?" Sarah asked, her pen poised above her notepad, though they both knew the answer. "You know me too well, Sarah," James replied with a warm chuckle, "though I might surprise you one of these days." The comfortable routine of the afternoon shattered with the sudden push of the diner's door. The bell's cheerful jingle seemed to take on an ominous tone as 2 police officers stepped inside, their presence immediately commanding attention. James felt the shift in the atmosphere, subtle but unmistakable, as the officers' gazes swept across the diner's interior before settling on him. Something in their purposeful stride toward his table set off warning signals honed by years of military training. James straightened his spine, muscle memory from decades of service taking over. The younger of the 2 officers, barely old enough to remember the war James had fought in, spoke first, his tone carrying an edge that cut through the diner's peaceful ambience. "Sarah, we're going to need to see some identification." The request hung in the air like smoke, heavy and acrid. James felt the eyes of other patrons turn toward his booth, the comfortable anonymity of his afternoon routine evaporating in an instant. Sarah, still standing nearby with her coffee pot, froze mid-pour, coffee dripping slowly onto the saucer below. "May I ask why?" James kept his voice level, drawing on years of discipline to maintain his composure. The older officer's hand rested casually on his belt, too close to his holster for comfort. "We received a call about suspicious activity in the area," the younger officer replied, his voice carrying a hint of condescension that made James's jaw tighten. "Just routine checks, sir." The word, "sir," carried none of the respect it deserved, instead dripping with barely concealed derision. James felt the weight of decades pressing down on him, years of similar encounters, different faces wearing the same expressions of unearned authority and prejudice. The diner had grown eerily quiet, the usual clatter of plates and murmur of conversations replaced by tense silence. Even the cook had stopped his work, peering through the service window with concern etched on his features. James could feel the familiar burn of indignation rising in his chest, but he kept his movements slow and deliberate as he reached for his wallet. Sarah, finding her voice, stepped forward. "Officers, Mr. Carter is a regular here." He's been coming to lose for years. Ma'am, please step back. The older officer cut her off, his tone brooking no argument. This is police business. James withdrew his veteran ID, along with his driver's license, placing them carefully on the table surface. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an intensity he hadn't noticed before, casting harsh shadows across the scene unfolding in his usual peaceful corner of the world. The younger officer picked up the IDs, studying them with exaggerated scrutiny while his partner maintained what he probably thought was an intimidating stance. James could read the disbelief in their expressions, the unspoken question in their eyes. How could this black man before them be a decorated veteran? The tension in the diner continued to build, thick enough to cut with a knife. A young woman at a nearby table had her phone out, its camera lens capturing the interaction with unwavering focus. James thought about all the similar videos he'd seen on the news, never imagining he'd be the subject of one himself. The familiar weight of the Purple Heart in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, a reminder of a time when he'd faced much greater challenges than the prejudices of two misguided officers. As the younger officer continued to examine his identification with unnecessary thoroughness, James felt a strange calm settle over him. He'd survived firefights in the jungles of Vietnam. He could certainly survive this moment of indignity in his own hometown. The sound of more chairs scraping against the floor drew his attention. Other patrons were standing now, their faces showing various degrees of concern and outrage. Mr. Henderson had set aside his newspaper, his usual stoic expression replaced by one of barely contained anger. The young couple by the jukebox had stopped sharing their milkshake, instead watching the scene with growing discomfort. Sarah hadn't moved from her spot nearby, her coffee pot still held like a shield in front of her. Her face showed a mix of emotions, concern for James, anger at the officers, and perhaps a touch of shame at witnessing such a display of prejudice in her workplace. "Sir," the younger officer finally spoke again, his tone suggesting he'd found something worthy of further investigation. "Can you explain why these IDs show different addresses?" James took a deep breath, maintaining his composure as he prepared to explain what should have been obvious. That one showed his old address before he'd moved to his current home. But before he could speak, the weight of the Purple Heart in his pocket seemed to pulse with purpose, reminding him of who he was and what he'd endured. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the windows, highlighting dust motes that danced in the air like silent witnesses to this moment of confrontation. Outside, life went on as usual. Cars passed by, people walked their dogs, children rode their bikes. Unaware of the small drama unfolding inside Lou's diner, where a man who had once put his life on the line for his country was being treated like a suspicious character in his own community. The contrast between the peaceful world outside and the tense atmosphere within the diner struck James with particular poignancy. Through the window, he watched a young mother push a stroller past the diner, her free hand holding that of a toddler who skipped alongside her. The sight reminded him of his own daughter, Angela, and how he'd once hoped the world she grew up in would be different from the one he'd known. Now, decades later, sitting in this booth under the suspicious gazes of two police officers, he wondered how much had really changed. The weight of the Purple Heart in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, as if absorbing the tension in the air. James thought about the day he'd earned it, the sweltering afternoon in the Vietnamese jungle, the air thick with humidity and the acrid smell of gunpowder. He'd been younger then than these officers were now, facing dangers they couldn't imagine, all while wearing the same uniform that their badges now claimed kinship with. Sarah's coffee pot had begun to shake slightly in her hands, the dark liquid within trembling like the surface of a pond during a storm. The young woman with the phone had been joined by others, their devices raised like silent guardians, documenting every moment of this increasingly tense encounter. The soft glow of their screens created odd patterns of light that danced across the worn linoleum floor, mixing with the natural sunlight and a strange urban ballet. "Sir," the older officer spoke again, his hand still resting near his holster, "we're going to need you to step outside with us." The words fell like stones in the quiet diner, each syllable echoing off the chrome and glass surfaces. Mr. Henderson's newspaper rustled as he fully set it aside, his weathered hands gripping the edge of his table with white-knuckled intensity. The young couple by the jukebox had abandoned any pretense of returning to their milkshake, their faces showing a mix of concern and embarrassment at witnessing this display of authority gone awry. James felt a familiar sensation creeping up his spine, the same heightened awareness he developed in the jungle, where every rustle of leaves could signal either danger or salvation. His training kicked in automatically, assessing exits, angles, positions. But this wasn't a combat zone. This was Lou's diner, where he'd celebrated his retirement, where he'd shared countless meals with friends and family, where Sarah had first shown him pictures of her newborn grandson just last month. The buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to grow louder, creating a persistent hum that matched the tension headache building behind James's eyes. The smell of coffee and apple pie, usually so comforting, now seemed to mock the situation with their homey normality. A fork clattered against a plate somewhere in the background, the sound sharp and startling in the tense atmosphere. Through the kitchen window, Cook, whose real name was Theodore but who had never been called anything but Cook in the 15 years James had known him, had stopped pretending to work. His dark eyes met James's across the distance, carrying a weight of understanding that spoke of similar experiences, similar indignities faced over the years. The younger officer shifted his weight, his polished shoes squeaking slightly against the floor. The sound reminded James of new boots in basic training, of young men trying to look tough while their footwear gave away their inexperience. He almost smiled at the memory, but the gravity of the present situation kept his expression neutral. "I don't believe that will be necessary, officers," James finally replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had commanded troops in combat. "My identification is in order, and I'm waiting for a friend to join me for coffee, as I do every Tuesday afternoon." A bead of sweat rolled down Sarah's temple as she finally set the coffee pot down on a nearby table, her hands still trembling slightly. The young woman with the phone had been joined by others, their devices raised like silent guardians, documenting every moment of this increasingly tense encounter. The soft glow of their screens created odd patterns of light that danced across the worn linoleum floor, mixing with the natural sunlight in a strange urban ballet. The air conditioning kicked on with a soft whoosh, stirring the paper napkin on James's table. It fluttered like a white flag in the artificial breeze, drawing his eye momentarily. The movement seemed to underplay the absurdity of the situation. Here he was, a decorated veteran, being treated like a suspect in his own community hangout. Mrs. Patterson, who had been quietly picking at her apple pie throughout the encounter, suddenly pushed her plate away with a decisive motion. The screech of her fork against the ceramic plate cut through the tension like a knife, causing several people to jump slightly. Her face, usually soft with grand motherly kindness, had hardened into lines of disapproval as she watched the scene unfold. The younger officer's radio crackled to life, spitting out a burst of static and garbled voices that seemed unnecessarily loud in the quiet diner. He reached for it with his free hand, his eyes never leaving James, as if expecting a 73-year-old man to suddenly bolt from his booth or pose some immediate threat. Outside, the autumn sun continued its slow arc across the sky, casting ever-lengthening shadows through the diner's windows. These shadows seemed to reach across the floor like dark fingers, touching each person in the scene. The officers, the patrons, Sarah still standing nearby, and James himself. They were all connected in this moment, whether they wanted to be or not. The smell of fresh coffee continued to waft through the air, mixing with the lingering sense of bacon from the lunch rush and the ever-present aroma of Lou's famous apple pie. These familiar smells, usually so comforting, now seemed to heighten the surreal nature of the situation. How could something so ordinary as the smell of coffee exist alongside something so extraordinary as this confrontation? James could feel the eyes of every patron in the diner on him, their gazes a mix of sympathy, outrage, and in some cases, shame. He'd felt similar gazes before, in Vietnam when he'd first been assigned to his unit, in various cities across America during his years of service, and even here in his own neighborhood from time to time. But this felt different somehow, more personal, more raw. The Purple Heart in his pocket seemed to pulse with each beat of his heart, its weight a constant reminder of who he was and what he'd survived. He thought about the men he'd served with, about Mike who was supposed to be meeting him here soon, about all the promises they'd made to each other in those dark nights in the jungle, about how they'd make the world better when they got home. Sarah had begun to wipe down a nearby table with mechanical movements, her eyes never leaving the scene unfolding in James's booth. The rhythm of her cleaning was almost hypnotic, circular motions that seemed to echo the cycling thoughts in James's mind about how much and how little had changed in the decades since he'd worn his country's uniform. The older officer shifted his stance slightly, his movement causing his utility belt to creak. The sound seemed to hang in the air, joining the hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft whir of the ceiling fans in a discordant symphony of tension. James noticed that the officer's nameplate read Thompson, such an ordinary name for someone participating in such an extraordinary moment. Through the window, James could see more people slowing as they passed by, their faces pressing against the glass as they tried to understand what was happening inside. The diner had become a fishbowl, with everyone inside on display for the growing audience outside. The afternoon sun caught the badges on the officers' uniforms, sending brief flashes of light bouncing around the interior like silent warnings. These flashes of reflected light reminded James of camera flashes from long ago, documentation of medals being pinned on uniforms, of handshakes with commanding officers, of moments when his service had been honored rather than questioned. The irony wasn't lost on him that now, in this diner where he'd spent countless peaceful hours, different kinds of cameras were documenting a very different sort of encounter. The younger officer, his nameplate reading Martinez, kept glancing between James's identification cards and his face, as if hoping to find some discrepancy that would justify their intervention. His fingers tapped in irregular rhythm against the laminated surface of the cards, each tap echoing in James's ears like distant artillery fire. A truck rumbled past outside, its vibrations sending minute ripples through James's untouched coffee. He watched the surface of the dark liquid tremble, thinking about how a single disturbance could spread out in ever-widening circles, affecting everything it touched. Wasn't that what was happening here? A single moment of prejudice creating ripples that touched everyone in the diner, perhaps extending even beyond its walls? The ceiling fan above spun in lazy circles, its shadows sweeping across the scene like the rotors of the helicopters James remembered from his service days. The mechanical whirring seemed to grow louder in the tense silence, marking time like a metronome as the confrontation continued to unfold. Mrs. Patterson had begun to gather her things, her movements deliberately slow and pointed. The soft clink of her spoon against her coffee cup seemed to carry a note of protest. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, kept darting between James and the officers, her disapproval becoming more evident with each passing moment. The smell of burning toast suddenly cut through the tension. Someone in the kitchen had forgotten about an order in the drama of the moment. The acrid scent seemed to unravel the wrongness of the situation. Another small detail gone awry in what should have been an ordinary afternoon. Cook appeared in the service window, his face set in grim lines as he watched the scene. His kitchen towel was twisted between his hands, the white fabric strained and wrinkled like the tension in the air. James caught his eye briefly, seeing in Cook's expression the same quiet anger he felt burning in his own chest. Sarah had moved closer to the phone on the wall, her hand hovering near it as if debating whether to call someone of the owner, perhaps, or some higher authority who might be able to defuse this situation. Her wedding ring caught the light as her hand trembled, sending another brief flash across the room to join the sparkle from the officers' badges. The young couple by the jukebox had started whispering to each other, their heads close together, their half-finished milkshake forgotten. Their words were too quiet to make out, but their body language spoke volumes. The way they leaned away from the officers, the way their eyes kept returning to James with a mix of sympathy and helplessness. Through the window, James could see more people gathering, their faces pressed against the glass like children at an aquarium. The afternoon sun cast their shadows long across the parking lot, creating a strange tableau of elongated figures that seemed to reach toward the diner like grasping fingers. Officer Martinez cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet diner. "Sir, these IDs show different addresses," he repeated, as if the words might have a different meaning the second time around. "Can you explain that?" Before James could respond, the bell above the door chimed again. The sound, usually cheerful, seemed almost confrontational in the tense atmosphere. Every head in the diner turned toward the entrance, where a tall figure stood silhouetted against the afternoon sun. The newcomer stepped inside, and James felt a mixture of relief and concern wash over him. It was Mike, right on time for their weekly coffee meeting, his old friend's face shifting from a smile of greeting to a frown of confusion as he took in the scene before him. Mike's arrival seemed to shift the energy in the room, like a new variable introduced into an unstable equation. His impressive height and military bearing, still evident despite his age, brought a new dynamic to the confrontation. He stood just inside the doorway, his shadow stretching across the floor to nearly touch James's booth. The Purple Heart in James's pocket seemed to grow warmer, as if responding to the presence of another veteran who understood its true weight and meaning. The medal had always been more than just medal and ribbon. It was a testament to sacrifice, to brotherhood, to the price paid for the very freedoms these officers were now choosing to question. Officer Thompson's hand twitched slightly closer to his holster, a subtle movement that didn't go unnoticed by either James or Mike. The fluorescent lights overhead continued their relentless buzz, the sound seeming to intensify with each passing second, matching the mounting tension in the room. Sarah's hand had finally settled on the phone receiver, though she hadn't yet lifted it from its cradle. Her knuckles were white with tension, her face a mask of concern as she looked between James, the officers, and the newly arrived Mike. The burning toast smell had been replaced by the usual cooking odors of the diner, but somehow these familiar scents now seemed out of place, too normal for the surreal scene unfolding beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights. James could hear the soft scrape of Cook's spatula against the grill, a sound that normally blended into the background, but now seemed to scratch against his nerves like sandpaper. The rhythmic scraping of Cook's spatula provided an almost musical undertone to the tense tableau, a steady beat beneath the symphony of silence that had engulfed the diner. The sound reminded James of the mechanical repetition of military drills, of boots on pavement, of the countless small routines that had structured his life in service. Mike took 3 measured steps into the diner, his movements deliberate and controlled, just as they had been in the jungle decades ago.